Before the storm hit, Hannah's life had been a portrait of simplicity and contentment. She was a devoted mother to her 2 children, a loving wife to her husband, and a cherished friend in her small, tight-knit community. Every morning, she would wake up early to prepare breakfast for her family, her hands moving with the ease of years of practice. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and homemade pancakes filled their cozy kitchen, a sound of comfort and routine that marked the start of every day. Her husband, Mark, would smile and kiss her on the cheek before heading off to work. They shared quiet moments, exchanging a few words about their plans for the day, always accompanied by a warm, familiar touch. Her children, Ethan and Sophie, had grown into teenagers, and although the house often felt chaotic with their laughter and occasional squabbles, there was always love in the air. Family dinners were a sacred time, with everyone gathered around the table, discussing their day and sharing stories. There was an unspoken understanding in their home. They were a team, and nothing could break their bond. Hannah was also deeply involved in her local community. She volunteered at the local church, helping organize charity events and offering support to families in need. She found great joy in being the shoulder others could lean on, always ready to lend a helping hand. It was a fulfilling life, filled with love, laughter, and the occasional struggle. But nothing that couldn't be solved with a bit of patience and understanding. On the surface, it seemed like there was nothing more anyone could ask for. Hannah had built a life full of meaningful connections, both at home and in the world around her. But despite all the happiness that surrounded her, there was an undercurrent of worry, a nagging feeling she couldn't shake. Her health had been deteriorating slowly, but she dismissed it as nothing more than the exhaustion that came with raising children and running a household. The tiredness was something most mothers could relate to, she reasoned. She didn't let it consume her. After all, what mattered most was keeping the family strong and together. But deep down, a small voice had begun to whisper that something wasn't right. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if life had become too peaceful, too perfect. And in that perfection, she failed to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface. One late afternoon, she sat in her favorite chair, sipping tea and watching the sun set behind the trees in their backyard. She felt a sense of peace wash over her, the kind that only comes when everything seems to be falling into place. But little did she know, in the next few hours, her world would be turned upside down. The call would come, and everything would change. The phone rang, breaking the tranquility of the evening. Hannah didn't think much of it at first. Perhaps it was one of her friends calling to chat, or a reminder about an event at church. But when she saw the name on the caller ID, her heart sank. It was the hospital. She had a sinking feeling in her stomach as she picked up the receiver, her hand trembling slightly. "Hello." The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an edge to it, something in the tone that immediately made her heart race. "Mrs. Turner," the voice asked. "This is Jujir Mitchell from St. Mary's Hospital. We need to talk to you about your husband. It's urgent." In that moment, Hannah's world seemed to collapse into silence. The words didn't quite register at first. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the statement. Her body froze as if time itself had stopped. She couldn't even speak, the words stuck in her throat. "Mrs. Turner." The doctor repeated, more insistent now. "We need you to come down to the hospital immediately." It took all the strength she had to respond, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened to Mark?" There was a pause on the other end. "There's been an accident. A serious one. He's stable for now, but we need you here as soon as possible." The line went dead. Hannah stood frozen for a moment, trying to comprehend what had just happened. She grabbed her coat, her legs shaky as she hurried to the front door, her mind spinning. Mark, her husband, her partner, the love of her life, was at the hospital, in an accident. Was it bad? How bad? Her children, confused and worried, followed her out the door, asking questions she didn't have answers to. "Mom, what's going on? Where are you going?" they asked, their voices trembling. "I'll be back soon. Kids, stay here, and I'll explain everything later," she said, though she wasn't sure if her own words had any truth to them. The uncertainty gnawed at her. She couldn't promise them anything. As she drove to the hospital, every red light felt like an eternity. The radio blared news stories she couldn't pay attention to. All she could think about was Mark. His smile. His touch. The warmth of his embrace when he came home every night. Was it all gone now? When she finally arrived at the hospital, a wave of dread washed over her. The sterile, cold smell of antiseptic filled the air, and her heart began to race faster as she approached the emergency room. She was met by a nurse, whose sympathetic expression didn't offer any comfort. "Follow me," the nurse said, leading her down long, quiet hallways. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if she were walking in a dream, a nightmare she couldn't escape from. They reached a room where Mark lay unconscious, hooked up to machines that beeped rhythmically. His face was bruised, and his right leg was in a cast. But the most striking thing was how still he was. Too still. The sight of him lying there, so vulnerable, so broken, was a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Tears welled up in her eyes as she held his hand, trying to reassure herself that he would wake up, that everything would be okay. But deep down, she knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a blur. Hannah barely left Mark's side. Every day, she sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand, talking to him, hoping that somehow his body would hear her voice, and he would open his eyes. But there was no response. He remained unresponsive, his body hooked up to machines that kept him alive, while his mind seemed to be lost in some unknown space. As the days turned into weeks, Hannah began to feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. The house, once full of laughter and warmth, felt empty and cold without Mark's presence. She struggled to keep everything together for Ethan and Sophie, who were grappling with their own pain and confusion. It was hard to explain to them why their father wasn't coming home, why the house felt so quiet, and why their family seemed broken. She found herself questioning everything. Why did this happen? What if I had done something differently? The guilt ate away at her, gnawing at her every waking moment. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. She couldn't fix this. She couldn't make Mark better. She couldn't bring back the life they had before the accident. And yet, she had no choice but to keep going. For Ethan. For Sophie. For herself. At night, after everyone had gone to bed, Hannah would sit in the living room, staring at the empty space where Mark's chair used to be. She would replay the events of that day over and over in her mind. The phone call. The drive to the hospital. The look in the doctor's eyes when he explained the severity of Mark's injuries. She could still hear the sounds of the beeping machines and the sterile, impersonal atmosphere of the hospital. It was all too much to bear. There were moments, though, when she felt a flicker of something inside her. Something stronger than the grief. Something she hadn't known existed. It was the desire to fight. One evening, after a particularly long day at the hospital, Hannah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her reflection staring back at her. She looked at the tired eyes, the stress etched on her face, and then she made a decision. She couldn't let this destroy her. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her family. It was about Mark. And if there was one thing Hannah knew, it was that she had the strength to push through, no matter how hard it seemed. The next morning, as she arrived at the hospital once more, she walked into Mark's room with a renewed sense of purpose. She sat down next to his bed, took his hand in hers, and whispered softly, "Mark, I need you to fight. We need you." For the first time in weeks, Hannah felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. She wasn't going to give up. She would fight for her family, for herself, and for the man she loved, and she would do whatever it took to get him back, no matter how long it took, or how hard the road was. Weeks passed, and the exhaustion began to set in. Hannah had been living at the hospital for what felt like an eternity. Mark had shown some small signs of improvement. His fingers twitched slightly when she held his hand, and his breathing was less labored. But those moments were fleeting, like whispers of hope that came and went too quickly to grasp. Every day was a struggle. The weight of the world felt heavier with each passing moment. Ethan and Sophie were growing increasingly distant. Their teenage hearts were confused and angry. They missed their father, and they missed the way things used to be. Sophie became withdrawn, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by the uncertainty. Ethan, on the other hand, had become more rebellious, lashing out at anyone who tried to comfort him. The quiet house felt like a cage. Hannah was doing her best to hold everything together, but she felt herself slowly unraveling. She couldn't keep up the act for much longer. The days blurred into one another, and her own health started to deteriorate. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. The pressure was suffocating, and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. One particularly difficult night, Hannah walked into the hospital room, tired and broken. She had barely slept the night before, and she felt as if she were running on empty. She sat down next to Mark, her fingers gently brushing his hand. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going. But I'm doing this for you. For us." Just as she was about to break down, something happened. Mark's hand twitched. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Hannah sit up straight. She watched in disbelief as his eyes fluttered open, just for a moment. The familiar blue of his eyes met hers, weak but unmistakable. "Mark," she whispered, her voice filled with hope and disbelief. His lips moved slightly, forming a word. "Hannah." The tears that had been building for weeks finally spilled over as Hannah clutched his hand tighter, her heart racing. "You're awake," she whispered through sobs. "You're awake." In that moment, Hannah knew that the fight was far from over, but it was no longer just hers to carry. Mark was coming back to her, and while there were still many battles ahead, battles of recovery, of adjusting to a new life, Hannah no longer felt completely alone. There were many things in life that they couldn't control. But as long as they had each other, she knew they could face whatever came next. The weeks ahead would be a difficult journey. Mark was not the same as he once was. The road to recovery would take time, and there would be many moments of frustration and fear. But Hannah was ready. She had already proven her strength. And now, with Mark slowly waking from his own dark place, she had the courage to push forward. Together, they would fight. Together, they would rebuild. The weeks following Mark's recovery were filled with small victories and setbacks. His body was healing, but the emotional scars of the accident were much harder to mend. Hannah watched him struggle with frustration as he tried to regain his strength. His once confident, carefree demeanor had been replaced with moments of doubt and vulnerability. Mark was a fighter, but this battle was different. It wasn't just about healing his physical wounds. It was about rebuilding his life. And their life. Together. It wasn't just the physical recovery that was hard for Hannah to witness. It was the way her family was shifting in a way that felt so unfamiliar. Ethan had come around, but it was clear that his relationship with his father had changed. The carefree bond they once shared was now clouded with anger and confusion. Sophie, though she'd opened up a little more, still carried the weight of seeing her father in a vulnerable state. The trauma of seeing him lying unconscious in the hospital haunted her quiet moments. For Hannah, it was as if she had to rebuild not just Mark, but her entire family. One afternoon, after weeks of navigating the slow pace of Mark's recovery, the family gathered in the living room. Ethan had been silent for days, his rebellious streak growing stronger. But something felt different that day. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet tension that hung between them all. Hannah knew they couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. They needed to talk, to face the elephant in the room. With Mark sitting on the couch, still recovering but more alert, Hannah finally broke the silence. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "All of us." The room grew still as Ethan and Sophie exchanged uneasy glances. Hannah took a deep breath. "I know things have been hard for all of us," she continued, "and I know that seeing your dad like this, after everything that happened, is difficult. But I also know that we are a family, and we can get through this together." For a moment, there was only silence. Ethan looked away, arms crossed, but then he spoke. His voice was rough, filled with anger and pain. How can everything just go back to normal, Mom? We're not the same. Dad's not the same. He's not the man he used to be. How are we supposed to act like everything is fine? It was a harsh question, one that Hannah had been dreading, but she knew it had to be asked. She looked at Mark, who sat quietly beside her. His eyes filled with regret but also hope. Hannah turned back to Ethan. We can't go back to what we were. But we can create something new. A new version of us. A version where we heal together, not just in body, but in heart. And it won't be easy, but we'll take it one day at a time. All I'm asking is that you give us that chance. The silence was thick, but then, slowly, Ethan nodded. I just miss the way things were, he admitted, his voice quieter now, a vulnerability creeping in. Safi spoke up then, her eyes filled with tears. I miss him too, Mom. I miss him so much. Hannah reached out to both of her children, pulling them close. I know, sweethearts. I miss him too. But we can't change what's happened. We can only move forward. And I need you both. Now more than ever. We need each other. Mark reached out his hand to Ethan, his voice hoarse but determined. I know I'm not the man I used to be. I don't expect things to be the same. But I will fight every day to be the father and husband you deserve. For the first time in what felt like forever, the family shared a quiet moment of connection. They weren't fixed, they weren't healed. But there was a shift. A shift toward healing. The road ahead was long and uncertain. But for the first time, they had hope, they had each other. And that, for Hannah, was the most important thing. Months had passed since that pivotal day when Hannah, Mark, and their children had faced the truth together. The recovery was long, but Mark had made steady progress, both physically and emotionally. He still struggled at times, and there were days when the weight of everything seemed too much for him to bear. But slowly, they were learning to live with the new reality. Hannah had learned that life wasn't about returning to what they had before, but about creating something stronger from the ashes of their old life. The family, though scared, was learning to heal, and that process wasn't easy. Ethan had opened up more to Mark, though their relationship was still fraught with complications. There were moments of anger, moments when Ethan would retreat into himself, but they were making progress. Safi, too, had begun to find peace. The bright, thoughtful girl that had withdrawn so deeply was starting to come back to life. With Mark and Hannah working to rebuild the trust and love that had been shaken. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But the family was stronger now, because they had learned how to face their pain together. The unspoken understanding between them had grown. They knew that, no matter what, they would be there for each other. Mark and Hannah had spent late nights talking, sometimes about the future, sometimes about the past. It wasn't always easy for Hannah to forgive herself for not seeing the signs earlier, or for not being able to prevent the accident, but she was learning to be kinder to herself. Mark had forgiven her long ago. He never blamed her for what happened. The real battle had been inside their own hearts, and now they were finding ways to forgive, to move forward, and to embrace their imperfections. They were learning to appreciate each other in a way they never had before. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, surrounded by the sounds of life and laughter. The kids fighting over the remote. Mark teasing Hannah about something small. Hannah realized just how far they had come. They were no longer a broken family, but a family that had been reshaped, rebuilt, and remade stronger than ever before. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer the things that defined them. It was the moments of love, of togetherness, of shared strength that would stay with them forever. As Hannah sat beside Mark, holding his hand as she had so many times before, she whispered, "I'm proud of us. We've made it through the hardest part." Mark squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "We're not perfect, but we're together. And that's enough." Their journey was far from over, but they had learned something invaluable. That the road to healing was never linear, but with each other, they could face anything. Together, they were unstoppable. And no matter what came next, they knew that they could rebuild and start again. as many times as it took. In the end, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about growing. And as they faced the future, they knew that their love would be the foundation on which they would rebuild their lives, one day at a time. Their story wasn't one of perfection, nor was it a fairy tale. It was real, raw, and full of the highs and lows that life brings. But Hannah Mark and their children had found a way to keep going, together. And for them, that was the greatest victory of all.